The next legislative session in Montpelier doesn't start until next January, but that comes quickly. In between adjournments and the starts of new sessions, a lot happens, and legislators are busy hearing from constituents about what's on their minds and reporting back and explaining often complicated pieces of legislation that have either passed into law or are under active consideration. Representatives Kathleen James and Seth Bongartz have been holding coffee hours across their district, which includes the towns of Manchester, Arlington, Sandgate, and a part of Sunderland, for some time now, and have more planned in the coming weeks. It's a chance for them to hear from constituents and for them to pass along what they've been working on. We stopped by at Charlie's Coffee Shop on Saturday, October 14th, where they were holding one to hear what was on everyone's mind. To no surprise, housing and energy issues topped the list. Those were areas the legislature was focused on last year, along with the budget, childcare, education, and other perennial questions they get to deal with. Representatives James and Bongartz spoke to both the energy and housing bills at length.
The Affordable Heat Act, that was a very controversial, hot topic bill that we passed last year. Two things are happening with that right now. The bill did not put the clean heat standard into effect. It did two things. The PUC is going to draft a set of rules for public comment. One thing that I've been meaning to do and just have not looked in on is when those public hearings are starting, when that public process is beginning, how Vermonters can follow along, can weigh in, can provide comments. That was something I meant to do before today. So the drafting of the draft rules will be a very public process, and those rules will be delivered to the legislature in draft form in January 2025. And they will become the basis for a brand new bill that the legislature will write from scratch. And it could look very different from the previous iteration of the bill, depending on what we find out in the second big milestone, the potential study, which is going to be published in September 2024. And that's going to be a very detailed study that's going to take a look at all the questions that the legislature and Seth and I and Vermonters rightly raised during the process of how is this really going to work? You know, how many Vermonters would benefit from heat pumps? Do we have the workforce to install them? Should we focus first on weatherization instead? Should that be the first big hit? Will this impact the price of fuel for everybody, and if so, how much? Really important question. And if it's going to impact the price of fuel, how do we then develop a bill in response to that that takes a look at that and makes it work for folks?
Let me just talk a little bit about flood resilience and housing. Over the last 2 years, we have put hundreds of millions of federal dollars, some of our own actually, into building affordable housing and some pilot projects for middle class housing. But in order to make that work, you also have to deal with the regulatory apparatus, because the reality is, and we attacked this last year, that a lot of our zoning ordinances are holdovers from the 60s and 70s. They haven't changed a lot. While my own view is that nobody ever set out to use zoning in Vermont as a means of discriminating, the reality is that zoning can have discriminatory impacts. Large lots in the middle of town become very exclusive, and so people can access them. And we all know the phenomenon of people who have less money living 30 miles away from the place they work because they can't afford to live anywhere near where they work, and that phenomenon. So again, my view is unintentional discriminatory impact does happen. So 2 years ago, Kathleen and I worked on a bill. We held the statewide housing conference in Arlington. God, that seems like a long time ago.
It does.
But anyway,
It was a great day.
but out of that, we got to know the players. That's the most useful thing that happened. So we really got to know the players, and we put together a bill 2 years ago that made it easier. This, by the way, I'm leading up to what's going on, what's going to be going on this year. We put together a bill 2 years ago that made it easier to do infill development in downtowns, and even if, because the problem we have, the conundrum we have, is that most of our towns are built on rivers for historic reasons. The problem with that is that with global warming and climate change accelerating to the extent that it is, we're seeing, as we all know, more and more flood events. The 100-year floods are coming every 6 or 7 years.
And then the conversation opened further.
2 questions. First
Yeah.
of all, how can the PUC develop rules if there are no objectives? I mean, what are you trying to obtain? Where are you trying to get to? I mean, and then you can develop a rule. Without that, I don't know how you can.
There are objectives
Well, can you tell us what they are?
to meet the partially to meet the goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act, but to implement the process. How would the credits work? For instance, how do the credits work for fuel dealers in the installation of energy saving, whether it's heat pumps or insulation or whatever? How does that credit market work? That's a key goal. That's one of the key things they're going to be working on.
If you don't know how many homes you're going to refurbish or weatherize or put in heat pumps, how can you develop a cost basis?
That's not their job. They won't be doing that. They won't be doing a cost basis. That'll come through the potential study and then through the legislative process afterwards.
So the PUC does not have any estimate, will not be developing any estimates of the cost to the citizens of
The
Vermont.
Public Service Department will do that.
So, like there's logging going on in national forest, or proposed logging in the national forest. There's a group called Standing Trees that wants to combat that. It would seem to make sense not to cut down old growth forest. So that's one issue. But the other issue is, like closer to home, on 3 Maple Drive, where I walk, they cleared about 32 acres for a new horse farm. Since that happened, there's a house on West Road, right at the corner of 3 Maple Drive, that there was horrendous flooding. There's this huge gash in the land, and it went across the road and destroyed the driveway of the house across the street. And this fellow, Tom Ragland, who lives in that area, he said this gash and the flooding happened only after those 32 acres were cleared. So I've also noticed other people buying up lots around me and just cutting every tree around. So I don't know if there's anything that can be done to slow down that process.
Well, the main thing that can be done is protecting forest blocks, intact forest blocks. And to the extent development is allowed in those forest blocks, make it be very clustered. So that
Licensed social worker in Vermont to be able to provide services to people who are out of state. And currently, the requirement is that literally if someone's physical body is in another state, even if they're a Vermont resident,
I know
that
what you're talking about.
you know what I'm
Yeah.
talking about.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to put in my 2 cents about really wanting to support that, because there's so many situations where college students, for example, who do go out of state at a time when they are most vulnerable and really need a lot of support, they're literally, if they are seeing a clinician in Vermont, they cannot continue that relationship when they're in college. It's crazy. So, yeah.
I was gonna ask if you could just do me a favor.
Mhm.
Just send Seth and I just a quick reminder.
I actually started a letter that I will.
Great, perfect.
I will finish and I will pass along.
Great, because we'll
Okay.
pass that along to the healthcare committee. The healthcare committee has been passing, and the legislature has been approving a bunch of these interstate compacts lately.
What do you see as the main value and virtue of these? What do you gain from having these meetings with citizens and constituents to?
Yeah, accountability, transparency, public engagement. The coffee hours that we do, sometimes 2 people show up, sometimes we get 15 or 20 people gathered around. It is incredibly important in any kind of a democracy that public officials, public servants be highly accessible, that we listen, that we're willing to engage in open debate, that everything feels calm and respectful and fun, which these meetings always are. People who vote for us or don't vote for us need to feel like they can show up, give us their ideas face to face, that we'll listen, that we'll take those ideas back to the legislature, and that they can be involved. And, you know, in a time, I think, when our democracy is so polarized and often feels so fractured, to be able to get everybody together around a table and say, hey, we do things differently in Vermont, is, to me, it's the most important part of my job. We have, we have one in November and one in December as we head into the session. And then Seth and I hold them more frequently during the legislative session. You can expect us to be holding these every other week in 2024.
There will be plenty to keep the lawmakers busy with this coming session. In addition to housing and energy, following the passage of the Affordable Heat Act, there will be the budget, the state's economy, opioids, rebuilding following last summer's flooding. Indeed, Montpelier may not be fully back to normal by then because of it. And it will also be an election year. So stay tuned. For the GNAT-TV News Project, I'm Andrew McKeever.